Hello everyone and welcome back to Programming and Access 2013, the Advanced course. My name is Steve Bishop, and in today's video we're going to be talking about importing JSON to a table from a RESTful web API. So, first and foremost, I apologize for the audio. I know it's a little different, but right now my wife and I are in the process of moving, so a lot of my computer equipment has been boxed up and is ready for packing, for moving. So unfortunately, the only microphone that I have available to me is my headset, my Bluetooth headset that I typically use with my phone. But it should still be clear enough that you guys can hear me, and you may have to turn up the volume a little bit in order to hear this video. But I think it's really important to get through this video. It's been a couple weeks since I posted the XML version of this, and I just really kind of felt guilty for not getting this out to you guys sooner, so I really wanted to make sure I got it done. So, importing JSON to a table from a RESTful web API. Now, in our last video, we were lucky enough to be working with XML data. And because we were working with XML output from our web API, we could just simply call this import XML method on our application to just go ahead and import an XML document and save it as a table. And it even has this DOM object and XML HTTP60 and all this good stuff that really makes it easy for us to work with XML documents. But unfortunately, JSON is a completely different animal. XML is very native to the Microsoft construct. Okay, Microsoft knows a lot about XML and it uses it pretty extensively in a lot of their programming. But JSON comes from the JavaScript world. It's a web construct, and because of that, it's JavaScript. It's not really intended to be something that's useful in VBA. It's for JavaScript, which is a web language. So what do? How do we kind of grab this JavaScript object notation that's so widely used out there? I think you can get it from pretty much like 95% of all web APIs uses some sort of JSON result. So how do you use that JSON result in Access when Access doesn't natively understand JSON? There's no built-in parser. There's no import JSON method on application. Well, typically what you're going to do is you're going to go out and you're going to search for something, right? You're going to go out and look for some sort of plugin or utility or third-party utility that does this for us. And let me just first start off by kind of looking a little bit at what we get back from our request. Okay, so we have this in our earlier request. We were asking with the accept header for XML, right? And so if we execute this, and we take a look at it, if we look at the raw values that come back, it's just one long string that gives us tags around each one of our values, right? And each one of these is called a node. So XML has these different nodes that have the values that are wrapped up in these beginning and ending tags. Well, JSON, if we look at it, comes back a little bit differently. So looking at the raw values that come back, you can see we start off with an open angle bracket and then an open curly brace, right? So we have an open bracket and a curly brace to start off with. And at the very end, we have a close curly bracket and a close brace, right? So it turns out that in JavaScript, an open bracket like this, an open brace, angled brace here like this, denotes the beginning of an array. And that array is delimited with commas. So there's a comma right there. And each bracket, each curly brace like this, is the start of a new object inside of that array. So here's the starting bracket here and the ending bracket here, and everything inside of here is part of the object, okay? And the object now has an ID, so the first property value name, or the property name is ID, followed by a colon with the value, and the value is just a 1. Then we have a comma saying this is the end of that property definition. The next property then is called first name, and it's again in quotation marks. And the value comes after the colon here, and its value is a string called first1. And we know it's a string because it has quotation marks around it. You can see 1 has no quotation marks around it because it's an actual integer. But here we have a string of first1, and we know it's a string because it's got the quotation marks around it. Then, of course, the end of that property, the first name property, is denoted with a comma. So we have a comma-separated values, basically, comma-separated properties. And each one of our objects here, okay, so here's object 1, starts from this curly brace here, and ends with this curly brace here. Now we have a comma, denoting here is our next object, starting with the curly bracket and ending with the curly bracket. Okay, so there's a certain structure to this JSON that we're looking at. And it all comes to us as one long string. And whenever we're dealing with strings, well, that's something that Access can handle. Access can work with strings, right? It just has to be able to know how everything is parsed out. What does each one of these commas and quotation marks and colons and brackets and open curly braces and open angled braces, what does this all mean? And if you know all that and you're working with strings, you can actually come up with some creative ways of drawing out the data. Now, we're not going to go through in this video, and I'm not going to show you how to do all of that, because guess what? Somebody else already did it, right? And if we go out and we look online, we do a quick little Google or Bing search, we can find different things like on Stack Overflow. People have already asked this question, right? How to parse JSON with VBA without external libraries. So I'm looking through here, and I see that the first answer comes from Kim Geisen, who posts this link to a code library on Google called vba-json. So this vba-json link goes to this CLS object here. So this is an object for VBA. And if you look carefully, you'll see some pretty common things. You've seen this before, right? Option explicit, constants, class initialize, and class terminate. These are your constructors and destructors. And then you have public functions and all sorts of stuff. Well, so this is really just a class that we can go ahead and copy. I'm going to start from this option explicit line here and scroll all the way down to the bottom and just go ahead and copy this. And then I'm going to paste this, since this is a class object, I need to paste this as a new class object in my class modules. So I'm going to go to class modules, go to insert, and create a new class module. Now I'm just going to go ahead and paste what I just copied, and now we have a class object that will do all of the parsing for us, and we don't have to go through and do all the dirty work, right? Because somebody else already did. Now, one thing, unfortunately, as a side effect of the copy and paste, we got all these extra lines in it, but that's okay. VBA doesn't really care that there's these extra lines, so you can leave it that way, but if you just want to clean it up, you certainly can if you want to go through this and change it all up. I will go ahead and copy this link and post it on the description to this video, so if you're looking to get a hold of this library, I will certainly make that available to you. But you can also, of course, just do a quick little search on how to parse JSON with VBA without external libraries, and you'll get to it. So since this is an external library, right, we're just copying and pasting it, making it our own class, we're not relying upon some other resource that we have to reference. It's just all internal, right? It's just a class object that's going to go ahead and parse the strings for us. So let's go ahead and debug this, because we want to make sure that what we copied and pasted works. So let's go ahead and compile this, and sure enough, everything works just fine. Let's go ahead and save this class object as, I'm going to call it CLS JSON parser. So that's going to be our class object that parses our JSON. And we should be good to go. Yeah, let me just compile that. Okay, good. So our class object that somebody else wrote is now in our application. Fantastic. Now, how do we use this, right? We got to go and figure out, okay, so somebody else already built it. You can look at the way that that the answer was constructed here by Kim, but honestly, she kind of uses a little bit differently than what we would use it for. So we kind of have to investigate this class object a little bit more ourselves. So what we're going to want to go ahead and do is look for the public functions, and there's one on here called parse. Okay, it's the very first one on here. And we pass into it a string, and it returns back an object. So if we want to parse the JSON, it seems pretty logical that we just need to pass into this parse function the JSON string. And then whatever the caller is that calls the parse function is going to receive back an object. Okay? Now what's an object? Well, I didn't really talk about this in our basic series, but there are these things called variants and things called objects. Now, a variant is just basically, I have no idea what this is going to be. So if I went, instead of as long, I said as variant, I have no idea what index, the variable index is going to be. It could be a number, it could be a string, it could be a class object, it could be anything if it's a variant. But objects, if I say as object, objects work a little bit differently, okay? And there's something called a reference type. If I were to go back and say, so this is supposed to be a, well, let's just backtrack this here. So it's going to be a long. There we go. Now, a long is a value type, okay? Which means that there's a very specific value that's stored in memory for this variable. In this case, that value is going to be just 1. Okay, now it could be any number, right? We could say instead of a long, we have a double or a single or an integer, right? But there's a very specific value that's going to be assigned to this. That's why we can just simply assign a value to the variable. But whenever we're dealing with something called a reference type, we have to use that set command, right? As we can see here, we're setting parse object equal to create object. We have to use the set command because it is something called a reference type. We are referencing a point in memory. We're not assigning any specific value. We're actually assigning a reference to something. Objects, okay, the object value type is simply a clean slate object, a clean slate reference type. We don't know what kind of reference type it's going to be. It could be a collection, it could be a dictionary, it could be a class object, it could be the error handler class object, it could be a type of pretty much anything except for a value type. It could not be a long, it could not be a double, it could not be a string or a byte or a boolean, okay? It has to be of some sort of complex type. And that's when we have to use the set command in order to set the value for whatever this object is going to be. Now, since this is a clean slate object, we don't know what type of object it's going to be. We only know it's going to be a object. We don't really know how to handle the call or the value that we get back from the call to parse, right? So when we're writing this code that we're going to eventually put here in our XML JSON method, or excuse me, our XML JSON module, we're going to need to know how to use this special parse method and understand what we're getting back as an object. An object, since it's just a clean slate, we can't really tell based upon this how we're supposed to work with the value that comes back. So we need to start looking into the actual way that this function works. And if you scroll down here and look, you can see we're setting parse, the value of parse, is getting set in 2 places, once here and once here, based upon a case, okay? And that case is looking at the first character in the string that we send to this parse method. So the first value, the first character that it gets, it's going to look and check and see if it's this curly brace or is it this angled brace. And if we go back here, we can see that the response that JSON gives us back is this angled brace, okay? And then the second character is going to be that curly bracket. And the reason why JSON returns back this angled brace like this, this angled brace is because this is an array of object. It is not a single object. It's an array. It's got multiple values inside of it. When we do our request where we have just a single value, so I'm going to change this to a post, and I'm going to go ahead and pass in that I want record 1. Now, when I post this, we get a single value back, right? So here's our JSON, but we're only getting one object back. And if we look at the raw value for this, we can see there is a curly brace to start this response. So when we have just a single object, we're getting just curly braces and no open and close brackets. So we need to know that, right? We need to know which line it's going to start with. What's the first character in our response back from our JSON? Because based upon that, it's going to determine which of these two methods gets called, and the values from those methods get set to our parse variable, okay? And then that parse variable, which is an object, returns back to whatever's calling it. So we could get either one of these two things based upon whatever that string is that we pass into our parse method. I hope everybody's following me so far. This is very complicated, so I don't want anybody to get lost, but just understand that if there's an array of objects, which means there's more than one, we're going to be starting with this angled brace. If there's only one object getting sent into this method, then it's going to start with curly braces, and that's going to call this method here. So let's go back to our original example here. So I'm going to get rid of the value there, get rid of this content length, we don't need that, and we're going to change this back to a get and execute and take a look. Okay, so we know that this particular request that's requesting a whole bunch of objects is going to return back this angled brace, and it's going to call this parse array. So let's take a look at it. Let's go to the definition here, and we can see that it returns back a collection object, and a collection object is in fact a reference type, okay? And that's why we see the set command in order to set parse array equal to a new collection, okay? Because this is a reference type. So we don't really need to get into the specifics beyond that, because now we know what it is we're going to be dealing with as a result back. We know that whenever we call that parse method and we pass in a string that begins with this angled brace, we're going to be getting back a collection, okay? Now, if we pass in just a single object as our string into this parse type, it's going to call this parse object method here. And the parse object method, if we go into its definition here, once again says it's just going to return back an object. But if you look more carefully at the code, you can see it's setting parse object equal to a scripting dictionary. Excuse me. So we're going to be returning back a dictionary if the parse object method is called. So you need to know that when you're dealing with your result. So let's go back here. And now that we know what we're dealing with when we call this parse method, we can go ahead and start our coding. Let's go ahead and go to our XML JSON module here. And you're not really supposed to do this because it means you probably need to do some refactoring of your code. But I'm just going to go ahead and copy this read XML code block here. I'm going to go ahead and create a new public sub and call it read JSON. And I'm just going to go ahead and paste everything that I copied from that read XML method, or subroutine, I should say. Okay. Now, there's a few things that we don't need on here because, again, this is not going to be XML. Now, deceptively, right, we've got this reader, which is an XML HTTP 60, and we do need this. Even though it says XML in it, and we're not dealing with XML, we need something to communicate with our web server, and that's this reader object. So we need to go ahead and keep this reader object XML HTTP. But we don't need this document 60 because the DOM document 60 is an XML formatted document. So we can go ahead and delete that. And we can go ahead and delete this part down here of what we're doing when we have a status 200. So we want to keep everything else that we've got, right? We want to keep the request the same. We're opening a GET request to our contacts URL. We're passing in an accept header, but the accept header needs to be, instead of XML, it needs to be JSON, right? Because we're requesting JSON. That's what we did right here, where we're saying our accept header is application JSON. Okay, now we're checking the ready state. Of course, we want to make sure that we get a proper ready state before we proceed. And now once we know that we have a status 200 on our request, what do we want to go ahead and do with this? So what we want to go ahead and do is we want to, since we know that the value that we're going to get back from our JSON parse is going to be a collection, let's go ahead and create a new variable that's going to contain that return value. So we're going to do dim, I'm just going to call it COLL. And since we're going to later be setting the return value to this collection, we don't need to new it up. So it's just going to be as a collection. Okay, so dim call as collection. Okay, so let's go ahead and get our values and assign it to that new call object. So let's go back into our reader status 200 code block here. And we're going to say set call equal to JSON, let's see, what do we call it? Oh, you know what? There's one other thing we forgot to do. We need to go ahead and new up this class JSON parser, don't we? So let's go ahead and dim that up. So we're dim, let's call this, I'm just going to call it JSON. Why not? And we can go ahead and new this up. Is CLS JSON parser. There we go. Okay. So we're just going to create this new JSON object that's going to be a type of class JSON parser. Okay, now inside of here, we're going to set COLL equal to JSON, and we're going to call that JSON object, and we're going to get that parse method that gets exposed, right? And in it, we need to pass in some sort of string, right? And that string is the value that we get back from our request. So that's going to be reader dot, and what we're looking for is the response text. Okay, so this is just going to be the text that comes back here inside of our response that we get back. So let's look at the raw here. So it's just this section here of our response, and it excludes all of this stuff up here. We don't see any of this. That text is just this part here. Okay. So that's going to pass in that actual text into our JSON.parse method, right? Our parse method that exists on our class JSON parser object. And it's going to set whatever comes back from that parse object, which, if you recall, here, let me just cut this. Let me get the IntelliSense here. You can see, again, it's going to return back as object, but we've already investigated, and we know that this is actually going to be as a type of collection. Okay, so we're going to get back a collection from this parse method. Now that we know that, what we also need to do is we need to actually open up the table that's going to contain the data that we get back. Now this is a little different than what we did with the XML document, because with the XML document, the XML function here, this application import XML, went ahead and created the context document, context table for us based upon the document that we implemented. But since we're parsing something to JSON, we could go through the whole rigmarole of trying to determine what the values are from this and creating a table from that. But really, since we already know the specific values that we're going to be getting back from this web API, it's not that hard to go ahead and use the same table to add to, let me go back here, so to add to our contacts table. So I'm just going to go ahead and clean everything out of here, just delete everything that's in here. and just leave this contacts table intact. But we need an email field, we need a first name field, last name field, a middle name field, and an ID, right? Because these are the values that we get back for each one of our records that we get back from our JSON response, right? These are the properties that we get back in our JSON, and each property, ID, first name, middle name, last name, email, can just be a column on our table. Email, first name, ID, last name, middle name. And then we're just going to assign, we're going to iterate through the responses of, that we're going to iterate through the collection here. And for each item in the collection, we're just going to go through and assign to our table the values for email, value for first name, ID, last name, and middle name. Okay, that's how we're going to do it. We're just going to go ahead and iterate through this collection now that we have a collection to work with that has all of our data. Okay, but in order to do that, we need a record set, right? We need to open up that table, that contact table. We need to open it up, and we need to go ahead and start and open it up as a record set. So we're going to go ahead and dim rs as, I'm going to go ahead and specify it's a DAO record set. You could, of course, dim db as DAO database if you wanted to. And then down here, what we're going to do is if we know that we've got a good 200, let's go ahead and set db equal to current db, and then we're going to set rs equal to db open record set, and now let's open up that contact table. Make it a db open dynaset and dbc changes. Okay, so we're just creating that record set and setting it to that contact table. And now what we can do is we can go ahead and iterate through each one of these collection items. But in order to iterate through each collection item, we need some sort of loop to go through our collection. So how do we do that? Well, we need to go ahead and create a new item variable as a variant, because we're going to do basically a for each loop here. For each loops are really nice to work with collections because they're enumerable. So we're going to go ahead and do for each item in call, and it's just going to be next. Okay, so for each item within the collection, we're going to do something. And let's go ahead and, on our record set, add a new record. And let's go ahead and update that record at the end. So we'll put our statements here of what we're updating here inside of our add new and update statements. And now let's go ahead and set RSID. It's going to be equal to what? What is it going to be equal to? We said item.id. Unfortunately, you'd be a little bit wrong. And here's where things get a little bit tricky. Collections can be a little goofy if you're not real careful. And you can see I've got this watches window here, and it is really going to help us determine what we're looking at when we want to see what's inside of different variables. And collections especially can get real tricky. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a breakpoint right here. And I'm going to go to my call collection option here. And I'm going to say add watch. Okay. And then it's going to ask me, add watch for which expression. I'm going to say the call object and go ahead and click OK. So it's adding to my watches window down here. It's going to watch what happens to that collection object. Now, let me go ahead and, yeah, we're good there. Okay, let's go ahead and call this read JSON. Let's just call this one time. And let's see what happens to our collection object here as we get to this breakpoint. So we can look inside, we can peer inside of our collection object, and we can see item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, item 6. So we're getting items, right? We're getting items inside of our collection. If we open each one of these items up, we can see what each one of them is, right? Now these aren't really in proper order. It just kind of assigns them kind of in odd ways, I think. but it is definitely valid here. So we've got a item 1 that's going to have 5 other items in it: ID, first name, middle name, last name, email, each one of these. So it's got a count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items in it. So how do we get to this item? Because we can see we're looking inside of call, and inside of item there are items. Okay, because inside of item 1 there's item 1 and item 2 and item 3 and item 4. So we're not really able to just call into item ID. This isn't going to work. Instead, what we need to do is we need to call item inside of the item variant here, right? So we've got this item variant here that's going to contain each one of those collection items. And inside of item, we need to once again call for the item inside of the item. Now we can use a special key that references that particular item. Let me go ahead and stop this here. So we're going to actually reference with a key a particular keyed item inside of our item object. So this sounds a little goofy here because of what we called this variant. Instead of item, let's call this contact. Okay, so we're going to be looking at each contact as a variant, and we're going to change this to for each contact in collection. And this is probably going to make things a little simpler. And I kind of wanted to go through this exercise because a lot of times we can get in the habit of using very generic terms like I did with item here and put it in as our collection. And it gets us caught up in the language because item.item, right, is just kind of weird. That's a weird syntax to be using. But if we use the correct naming of contact to indicate, hey, each item within this collection is actually a contact item. So I'm going to name it contact. And now we can dig inside of that contact, and now we can look and find the ID value, or the key of ID inside of that contact item. And let's go ahead and set the RSID value equal to whatever that contact item is. Okay, so that's how we're going to dig down into that collection and find out what the value actually is. So let's go ahead and continue this on for, okay, so we have ID, we have first name, it's going to be contact item first name, okay, because this is, again, this is the name that we have for the property name that we got on our JSON collection here, right? So first name, and we need middle name, we need last name, and email. So let's go ahead and do all that. RS middle name equals contact item middle name. RS last name equals contact item last name. And then finally, we have RS email is equal to contact item. The item within our contact information is email. Okay, so this is going to go ahead and look inside of each one of our contacts, look at the item list inside of our contact, find the ID item in our contact, and assign its value to our ID value, which again just points to our contact table. So there we go. That should do it. Let's go ahead and save this and debug it, make sure everything works. Just so that we, well, we don't need to worry about those watches at this point. I just kind of wanted to show you that before. So let's go ahead and call this read JSON. And once again, before I do that, I should probably point out, again, the contact list is completely empty. There's nothing in here. And let's go ahead and run this read JSON. Everything went fine. It didn't give me any sort of error messages. It didn't say unable to import data or anything like that. So it looks like everything worked. Let's go ahead and open up the contacts table, and voila. There is our data, which came to us as in the form of JSON, and it is now inside of a table. So there you go. That's a lot to kind of mull over, and I'm sure there's some very complicated items in this. We're dealing with a lot of different concepts. We're dealing with record sets. We're dealing with that XML, HTTP 60 item object up there. We're dealing with collections and iterating through those collections and trying to dig down into them and looking at the items. We're dealing with naming and how should you properly name a variable. So we're dealing with a lot of stuff, and I covered a lot in this video. So I'm sure there's going to be some questions about it. Please feel free to drop me your questions in the comment section below this video, and I'll do everything I can to answer them. But hopefully this has been clear enough that you guys can use this in your own applications and know what you're doing. All right, thank you so much, and hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe.